Hey everyone, today I'll show you how to make this hyperspace design using Blender geometry nodes. There's nothing too fancy, there's no difficult logic or nodes or anything, so we'll have a lot of fun designing this. Let's get started. So let's dive into our geometry nodes setup here. Cube is selected, so we'll click New, and we don't need the cube's geometry. Click the group input and press X. Instead, what we'll do is Shift A and we'll bring in a cylinder, and we can Option or Alt Shift left click that to connect it to the group output. Now we can see our cylinder. Right away, let's actually transform the geometry and spin it on the x-axis 90 degrees. And then this will represent basically the tunnel full of stars. This will be our hyperspace tunnel. And we can change the radius like so. We can also change the depth. Both will want to drive with group input. So let's connect the depth to a group input. Let's connect the radius to a group input as well. Press N to pull up the sidebar, and we'll call this section length, and we'll call this section radius. Great. But now what I want to do is center this so that if we go to the top view with tilde, this is in line with the world origin. So using this transform geometry here, we can take the section length and combine that with an XYZ node into the Y, so that we'll translate it half this length so that it snaps back to the origin. So we'll take a math node, add that in, and divide by 2. And now that snaps. So now we can adjust the section length in the geometry nodes modifier and set some kind of length that we want, say even 100. We're going to be flying through this tunnel, this hyperspace tunnel. So sweet. So now let's get some points in this volume. Let's take a mesh to volume, and it totally disappeared. I wonder if this 100 meters is too much for now. Okay, I don't quite understand that, but let's reduce the section length for now. And now that we can see our volume, we can bring in a distribute points in volume node, and that will add these random points throughout that volume. You can play with the density. For now, we'll leave it pretty low, but we'll definitely be tweaking that later. So now let's start to get some of those star streaks here. We have all these points, so if we say instance on points, we can bring in a curve line. And I want to use a curve because we'll give it a profile when we convert it to a mesh. And this is facing up, so let's set the Z to 0, but the Y to 1 for now. And if we bring in a curve to mesh node, Shift D this curve line, and plug that into the curve profile, now we have just all these planes, but let's change the Z to be 0 and Y to be 0, but let's give it some X. So this is super simple geometry. Let's go back to our camera, press Alt R, Alt G, and that'll snap it back to the center, and RX 90 to rotate it on the X axis. And then if we go to our camera view, we can start to see, let's pin this here. We can start to see what these look like. So maybe let's make those a little bit thinner. What happens if we play with these numbers? I kind of like how it's stretching and giving it more of a point, playing with that Z value. That looks pretty cool. I like that. Awesome. Now let's add some randomization to these so we get some variable widths. So Shift A and bring in a scale instances node. And what we can do is we can pull in a random value. And for now, maybe let's just try a float so that it's the same value across all axes, and set the min to be, oh, of course, connect that to the scale. Set the min to be some amount that looks okay, and the max just to your liking. I think that looks pretty good there. You can always tune it later. So let's move these to the side. And what I want to do now is let's add another scale. And I want to control specifically the Y vector so we can give it some stretch, some extra length. So let's add, let's set all of these to 1, but then for this Y, let's actually pull in a group input, and we'll call it stretch. Okay, default 1, min 0. And now what that should let us do is, as we move this stretch slider, there you go, you get longer star streaks like that. I think that looks pretty cool. So now let's start to visualize what this would look like with some materials. Really quick, let's drop in a set material after these streaks here. And we'll go into just our normal geometry nodes tab, and that will let us play with the materials on this side here a little easier. So I'm going to rename this material star, and it's a basic shader. We'll just give it like a blue, like a bright blue, and then an emission strength of 20, 30, something like that. And we'll set the set material node to be that star material. So now if we go into material preview, we start to see some color on those. But of course we're in Blender 4.2, so we need to make our own bloom here. We'll go into the compositing tab, click use nodes, and Shift A to add a glare. Change that to bloom, mix -0.9, and we'll change the 3D viewport and set the material preview, and then in this drop down here, compositor always. So now if we go into the camera, we can start to see this beautiful hyperspace kind of effect. So let's go into our render tab here, and down at the very bottom we have color management. Let's change the look. Oh, that's nice. I like that. Just play around with the look until you find something that suits you. I really like that. But I don't like the gray. Let's change the world to be, let's actually make the strength 0. And let's make sure we're looking at the world, scene, and lights with this drop down. So now we have an accurate depiction of our world settings. Let's change this to a volume, and we'll click and change it to a principled volume. Let's change the color to something white. I don't know why I'm getting all these bumps there. Maybe it's too dense. Let's bring the density down around there. I'm looking at what the fade looks like in the back there. Without any density, it's pretty bright back there, but that pushes those objects further back in the distance using a bit of density, not too much. It's pretty subtle. All right, another thing that I want to do is let's go into the layout. We have this light right here. Let's go into the front view and let's pull this light down a bit further to the camera. It should be a little bit in front of it's a little bit in the positive Y. Let's Shift D that and bring that over on the X, and then go back to front view, and let's grab that and pull it down. Press Z to snap it onto the Z axis. So something like that. We have these two lights. Maybe what I'll do is split this screen here so we can see those lights, and then get a view camera set to the material preview. And we'll have to do the same thing here to go to scene lights, scene world, compositor always. Huh, why does this look different? Go to world, strength 0, volume. Weird, why is it so bright? Okay, that's fine. We'll bring that down. These scene lights though, let's give this some color. So we see in the top right, we see this pink purple, and in the bottom, let's give it like a green, blue green. So these are pretty far apart. What we should do is Shift A to add an empty, and just plain axis is fine. And then let's take each of these lights, and there we go. It's hard to click that axis, but let's parent those. So Command or Control P and keep transform. And now what we can do is with that empty selected, we can scale those. And as we scale, you can see the effect in the 3D viewport. So that'll change how much of that color actually comes to the camera. I think that looks pretty cool. And you can press R as well to rotate, to offset that color. I like how we have some purple in that bloom there. I think that's looking pretty good. All right, let's go back to the geometry nodes tab there. And last thing I'm gonna do really quick is click on this camera, viewport display, and crank this passport to, just so we kind of knock back the outer colors there. Okay, so let me show you how we're going to move this as part of our animation. If we consider this whole setup here as an instance, I'm going to Control J F2 this and call it points, grab that here, and then select that, Control J F2, call that stars, actually call it star section. But now what we want to do is, I don't want to keyframe the camera at all because I want this to be easily tweakable. So instead of keyframes, what we'll do is we'll shift this whole section towards and through the camera. So using a transform geometry node, if we translate in the -Y, you can see how it moves through the camera. It looks like the camera's moving forward, but we're really just shifting this whole section. So we want to drive that with the playback. And I'm going to use a different setup than I normally do. Normally I have a duration group input that I would tweak in this geometry node, But instead, the problem with that is if you change the duration from 3 seconds to 5 seconds, now you have to adjust your end frame as well. So you have to change the two settings so that they're in lockstep. And speaking of playback, let's change this to 30, maybe 60 later, but we'll set it to 30. So instead, what I want to do is I want to copy this end frame as a new driver. So right click the end frame down here. Let's actually make it 150. So now this will play for 150 divided by 30 is 5 seconds. So if we right click this copy as new driver and bring in a value node here, in fact, make it an integer constant, we can paste that as the driver. And if we shift A and pull in a scene time, we can take this frame and using a math node, take the frame and divide it by the number of frames that we've set up for our loop. So that means at 0 frames, 0 over 150 is 0, but at 150 frames, that's 100%. So we're at the end of our loop. So we're going to use this to drive our setup. And so we need to translate this entire section by the section length within this amount of time. Well, we know the section length, that's the group input. And so if we pull in another math node, we'll just shift D and bring this over and multiply by that section length and control H to hide all the unused inputs. Now we have this setup that will shift this whole section by its length over the entire duration of this loop. But the problem is we need to actually combine an XYZ, drop that in there and change it so that it's only on the Y. But now we're going backwards. So super easy fix is we'll just take this, shift D, multiply by -1. And using shift left arrow to go to the start of playback and press spacebar to play, you can see that we start to move through that section of stars. Now, when we approach the end, you can see that there aren't any other stars behind us. So we need to add more sections. Well, how do we do that? Well, let's move this over here. Let's maybe group this and call it Control JF2 section offset. And again, this is one whole instance of a section. What we can do is simply add more section instances. So let's take a mesh line. And instead of this section going to the group output, what we're going to do is pull in an instance on points. This connects to the group output instead. We can control right click, cut that connection, and we'll use the points from this mesh line. Right now, let's just say 1, and we'll show this star section instance on each point. And we'll set up this mesh line so that it has 1 point here and then a point at some offset that we specify, and it'll have however many points we specify as well. So if we want to have 4 of these sections for our loop, we'll have an input that says we need 4 points offset by a certain amount. And on each point, it will instantiate an entire star section. So they'll just be laid out back to back. So we have our count of 1. That means there's only, if we control shift, left click this, there's only 1 point in this mesh line. It's really just a single vertex. If we increase that count to 4, you can see that there's now 4 points offset by 1 meter each. So we want to offset in the Y, combine X, Y, Z, no X offset, no Z offset, but we want this group input to be our section length. So now we've got, going to our geometry nodes tab, a section length of 50 meters. You can see that each point is 50 meters apart on the Y axis. All right, let's remove the viewer node. And so now we have this count of 4. Well, let's drive this as well with the group input, and we'll call that section count. So we have our section count, our section length. So now what we need to do is just plug this instance on points into this transform geometry. This is the driver that shifts the whole scene. And if we hit play, we'll start to fly through all of that geometry. So let's make sure that we have a truly looping animation. We're on frame 1, we end on 150. So if we hit shift right arrow, this is the last frame of our loop. If we right arrow one more time to frame 151 and hit shift left, there shouldn't be any change. And I'm definitely seeing a change there. Start of the loop, end of the loop, start of the loop. So there's definitely a change. And I think what's going on is some of these points are instantiated within the section, but then we add this plane that's super long. So they're actually going further out of their section. And even though we have a new section back to back, at the end of the animation, when our camera is right here, we see these endpoints kind of bleeding into the next section, so it looks different than it does at the very start here. That might be confusing, but all we'll do is we'll make sure that we have at least three sections, which we're good. We have 4. And then what we can do is we'll actually change the camera so that, or I guess not the camera, the scene doesn't start at 0 here. We'll shift it by subtracting an entire section first. So that means the scene is kind of now in the middle. When playback starts, we've already gone a section ahead. And so when we look at the camera, what we should see is what that overlap looks like at the end of our loop previously. So now we're on frame 1, shift right, right again, and now shift left, and it looks exactly the same. So I think we're good, completely seamless. If you're enjoying the tutorial, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. This helps the channel grow and helps other Blender artists discover this content as well. And let's Ctrl-J, F2 this and call it number of sections. Okay, that's pretty much our node setup, I think. If we play it back, we should see a beautiful loop right about now. And it just keeps going indefinitely. So if you want to tweak the speed, you can change the frame rate here. But if you want a longer loop, say the 5 seconds like we initially had, and increase the section length, maybe we'll try that 100 again. For some reason, it doesn't like 100. We can do 90. Some of these planes look a little odd. That one right there, we can see that line for a few frames. I don't like that. All I had to do, it took a bit of playing around, but I just changed the seed of the point distribution. And it turns out that now there isn't a point that's flying so close to the camera lens, essentially, that I don't see that clipping anymore. But I do want to try making this longer, because as you increase this section length, say to 200, that factors into the speed. And I think if we turn up the section length and just maybe, there we go. We just have to increase the voxel amount on the mesh to volume. And so now, because the section length is longer, the section has to be shifted a greater amount in the same amount of time. That means that it's perceived to be traveling much faster. And I think if we even change this to maybe 300, we get the same issue there. So just keep cranking this voxel amount up. That might be too fast for my liking, so let's change that back to maybe 200. That looks pretty sweet. Very cool. All right, so now we're getting ready to render this out. Let's go into our compositor and let's just tweak it a little bit with maybe the saturation and brightness. That's looking nice. I like the purple and the cyan. And let's change the brightness and contrast a little bit. Probably add a bit more contrast there. Oh, that looks so sweet. And maybe what we can do, I'm pretty happy with how this looks here as far as the brightness, contrast, and the colors. One last tweak. Let's try, I'm just going to save it in case it crashes. Let's try increasing the section radius. See if we can get more stars in there. That'll definitely add some more points to the scene, some more instances. I do like a bit of space here, some breathing room. I don't want this like all lines. So that's looking pretty good. Maybe 3. Let's just try 2.5, split the difference. That looks pretty nice. And one last thing before we go to render settings for this, let's look at the camera. We'll click that to select it. Go to the camera options here, the object data properties. And if we change this focal length to a lower focal length, oh, that's looking even cooler. Oh, I'm glad I tried that. That will also increase the perception of speed. So if you decrease the focal length, you can also probably decrease this section length quite a bit. Beautiful. That also increases the perception of the stretch too, but I really like how that resulted in seeing more of this red and green glow. So I'm pretty happy with that. One last thing that I want to do is we have this section offset. I also want to, over time, add just a bit of rotation. So just another dimension of movement. and we'll rotate it on the Y using math, and we'll change this to multiply, and we'll say we'll rotate tau, so 360 degrees every loop. So we start off without any rotation, and as it loops through, it spins a perfect 360 degrees. It's rotating a little fast, and maybe this is kind of the downside of driving this whole thing with the frame. But let's change this to maybe 200, and so that'll slow the rotation down. And I saw a weird artifact there, so let's go into the lights and let's turn off shadow for both of those lights. We don't need to see the shadow at all. And that should look better without them casting any shadow. So now let's go and render this out. So let's go to layout here, go to our render tab here. Eevee is good. We can turn on ray tracing. I'm not sure if that makes a difference in this scene. So the output we'll set to 1920 by 1080, 30 frames per second. Output is good there. Let's change the file format to FFmpeg, encoding to Matryoshka, change the output quality to perceptually lossless, and I think that's pretty good. All right, so last thing to do is go up and render animation. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed learning with me, and if you need help with anything, leave a comment so we can help you out. And since you're into geometry nodes, check out this Plexus tutorial I did. Just click and enjoy.